The labor contract promised wages, housing, and a future. 23 families signed in the spring of 1923. Their thumbprints pressed beside names they couldn't read in English. What the document actually bound them to wouldn't become clear until they reached the Blackburn estate, 20 miles from the nearest California town, where the gates closed behind them. The drought had lasted 3 years across northern California's rural communities. Fields turned to dust, and families who'd worked the same land for generations found themselves with nothing. When the labor recruiter arrived in the small towns where Mexican and Filipino immigrants had settled, his timing was perfect. He wore a clean suit and spoke in reassuring tones about opportunity, about the Blackburn agricultural operations in the Central Valley, where work was plentiful and housing was provided. Rosa Delgado had listened carefully to his presentation in the church basement. She was 38, widowed 2 years earlier, responsible for her daughter Alina, who'd just turned 20. The recruiter showed them photographs of neat worker housing, talked about fair wages, about families staying together. He had documents prepared, pages of legal language that few in the room could fully parse. The critical sections were buried deep, phrased in terminology that obscured their actual meaning. Household service obligations sounded reasonable enough. Everyone understood that agricultural work sometimes required flexibility, that during harvest season or when special needs arose, workers might be called to different tasks. What wasn't clear in the deliberately confusing text was how broadly the Blackburns interpreted household service, or that these obligations could extend to any family member the estate deemed suitable. Rosa signed because she had no choice. Elena signed beside her mother's name. They were among 23 families, nearly 90 people total, who made their marks on contracts that promised stability but contained clauses that would trap them in something far worse. The journey to the estate took 2 days by truck. The families traveled together, their belongings piled in the back, watching the landscape change from the drought-stricken towns they knew to the sprawling agricultural lands of the Central Valley. The Blackburn property stretched across thousands of acres, its boundaries marked by fencing that seemed designed more to keep people in than to keep livestock organized. When they arrived at the main compound, the recruiter's demeanor shifted. The neat worker housing from the photographs existed, but it was surrounded by watchtowers and locked gates. Men with rifles stood at intervals along the perimeter. The families were processed through an intake building where their documents were collected for safekeeping, and they were assigned to their quarters. That first night, locked in the dormitory with the other women and their adult daughters, Rosa felt the first stirrings of real fear. Elena sat beside her on the narrow bed, and they said nothing because there was nothing yet to say. They didn't know what they'd agreed to. They wouldn't understand for several more weeks. But the gates had already closed, and the contracts they'd signed held weight that extended far beyond what any of them had imagined. The Blackburn estate operated as its own world, isolated and self-sustaining. The main house stood at the compound center, a sprawling structure of dark wood and stone that seemed to watch the workers' quarters with blank windows. Beyond it stretched orchards and fields, storage facilities and processing buildings. Everything needed to run an agricultural empire without depending on the outside. There was a company store where workers could purchase supplies, though the prices consumed most of their promised wages. A small chapel offered Sunday services led by an estate-approved minister who preached about obedience and the virtue of honest labor. The nearest actual town lay 20 miles away across flat valley land with nowhere to hide if someone tried to walk it. County records from 1923, discovered decades later, showed regular payments from the Blackburn family to the local sheriff's department, listed as security consultation fees. The amounts were substantial. Law enforcement had been bought long before the families arrived. The separation began on the third day. Male family members were assigned to field crews and housed in barracks on the compound's eastern edge. Women and their adult daughters were told they'd been selected for domestic training at the main house. Rosa watched her cousin's husband led away with the other men, saw the confusion and worry in his face, but protests seemed pointless when armed overseers stood watching every movement. The women's dormitory was a long, narrow building with rows of iron beds. Windows were barred ostensibly for security. The door locked from the outside each night at 800. Inside, the mothers and daughters tried to make sense of their situation, speaking in whispers after the lamps were extinguished. Daily routines established themselves quickly. Before dawn, the women were released and marched to the fields for 10 hours of harvesting work. The daughters worked alongside their mothers, picking fruit in the brutal Central Valley heat. At dusk, they returned to the dormitory while the men's crews continued for another 2 hours. Dinner was brought to them, plain food served in tin bowls. Then the locks engaged for the night. Rosa began noticing the monitoring almost immediately. An overseer named Garrett made rounds past the dormitory every hour after lockdown. Mail delivery came once weekly, but letters the women tried to send were collected and never seen again. When Catherine Flores asked about posting a letter to her sister in Sacramento, she was told that estate policy required all correspondence to be reviewed first for security purposes. No letters were ever approved. By the second week, Rosa found a loose floorboard beneath her bed. The space underneath was narrow but sufficient. She began keeping a diary on scraps of paper she smuggled from the main house, documenting everything she observed: the names of the overseers, the routines of the guards, the layout of the compound. She didn't know yet why she felt compelled to record these details. only that some instinct told her evidence might matter. The other mothers began to understand their situation through small revelations. Maria Santos discovered her contract specified she could be reassigned to any duties the estate required with no right to refuse. Another woman learned that attempting to leave before the contract term ended, 3 years, would result in criminal charges for breach of agreement. The local courts, they were told, always sided with the estate. The daughters sensed the danger before the mothers fully grasped it. Elena Delgado watched how certain overseers looked at the young women during fieldwork, lingering stares that made her skin crawl. Other girls noticed the same attention. They began staying close to their mothers, an instinctive protective clustering that would prove insufficient. On a Sunday evening, 6 weeks after their arrival, Rosa hid her growing diary pages in the space beneath the floorboard and pressed the board back into place. She documented the compound's operations, the names of families, the systematic isolation from outside contact. She didn't yet know what would be done to their daughters. That understanding would come soon enough when the first summons arrived, and the mothers learned the true price of the contracts they'd signed. The chapel bell rang for evening prayer. The women filed out of the dormitory in silence, and the locks clicked shut behind them with a sound that was beginning to feel permanent. The first summons came on a Thursday night in late August, 6 months after the families had arrived at the compound. Rosa was already in bed when she heard the dormitory door unlock outside the normal schedule. Garrett, the overseer, entered with a lantern and called out a name. Elena Delgado, main house. Now, Rosa sat up immediately, her heart hammering. Elena looked at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. Other women stirred in their beds, watching in the dim light as Elena stood slowly. She was still in her nightdress, and when she moved toward the door, Rosa tried to follow. Garrett's hand went to the pistol at his belt. Just the girl. Where are you taking her? Rosa's voice came out stronger than she felt. Main house needs extra help tonight. She'll be back by morning. His tone made clear the conversation was over. Elena glanced back once as she stepped through the door. Then it closed and locked again, and Rosa was left standing in the darkness with 20 other mothers who now understood that something terrible had begun. Elena returned at dawn. She wouldn't speak about what had happened, but her silence said everything. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. There were marks on her wrists like someone had gripped them too tightly. She moved carefully, as if her body hurt. And when Rosa tried to embrace her, Elena flinched away. "Don't ask me," Elena whispered. "Please don't ask." But Rosa didn't need to ask. She could see the trauma written in her daughter's vacant stare in the way she sat on the edge of the bed and wouldn't lie down, as if sleep was impossible now. The summons became regular. Elena was called twice more that first week. Then other names began to echo through the dormitory at night. Catherine Flores' daughter, 19-year-old Anne. Maria Santos' daughter, 22-year-old Lucia. Always the adult daughters, never the mothers. Always returned before dawn with the same hollow expressions, the same careful movements, the same refusal to speak about what happened in the main house. The pattern was deliberate and systematic. The Blackburns and their associates, the overseers and various men who visited the estate on business, had interpreted the household service obligations in the contracts exactly as they'd intended. The daughters were being used, and their mothers were powerless to stop it. Rosa tried once to intervene. When Garrett came for Elena the fourth time, Rosa blocked the door and demanded to speak with whoever was in charge. She insisted her daughter was ill, that she couldn't work tonight. Garrett's response was swift and brutal. He had Rosa dragged to the tool shed at the edge of the compound and locked inside. She spent 3 days there in complete darkness with no food, and only a bucket of water that had to serve for drinking and sanitation both. When they finally released her, Garrett delivered a message that the other mothers had already received. "You interfere again. Your whole family loses the contract. You'll be turned over to immigration authorities and deported. Your daughter will be charged with breach of agreement and sent to county jail. You understand?" Rosa understood. In 1923, immigrant families had no legal protections. Local law enforcement worked for the estate. Immigration authorities would ask no questions. The courts would side with the Blackburns, who had money and power and connections. The mothers had nothing. So they were forced to listen each night when names were called. Forced to watch their daughters leave and return damaged. Forced to see the evidence each morning when they cleaned the main house as part of their domestic duties, finding torn clothing and stained sheets and other signs of what had been done. Rosa began documenting everything in her hidden diary. Each summons, each daughter's name, the visible injuries, the frequency. The other mothers contributed what they observed. It became a collective testimony, though none of them yet knew what purpose it would serve. They only knew they were witnessing an atrocity they couldn't stop, and that bearing witness was the only power they had left. Rosa's diary grew thicker through the fall of 1923. Each entry was written in cramped handwriting on whatever papers she could steal from the main house during cleaning duties. She documented patterns that emerged from the horror, creating a record that was part evidence, part confession of her own helplessness. Elena was summoned every 4 to 6 days. The frequency seemed calculated to break her spirit without making her physically unable to work. Other daughters followed similar schedules, though some were called more often than others. Rosa noted which men arrived at the estate on which nights, correlating their visits with which girls were summoned. The Blackburn sons, Richard and Thomas, were the most frequent offenders. But business associates and visiting landowners also received this particular hospitality. The diary became a collaboration. Catherine Flores would whisper observations to Rosa during fieldwork. Maria Santos passed notes during chapel services. Each mother contributed what she'd seen, creating a comprehensive account that no single woman could have compiled alone. They hid the pages in Rosa's floorboard space, wrapped in oilcloth against moisture. Rosa's most devastating entries were about cleaning Elena's room each morning. As part of her domestic duties, she was assigned to the servants' quarters where the daughters were kept overnight after being summoned. She would find Elena's few belongings disturbed, her wash basin filled with bloodied water, her bedding twisted and stained. The physical evidence of violence was everywhere, but Rosa had to clean it away, erasing the proof even as she documented it in writing. Elena stopped speaking almost entirely. She moved through her days like a sleepwalker, performing her work in the fields with mechanical precision but showing no emotion, no reaction to anything around her. The light had gone out of her eyes. Rosa watched her daughter disappearing into herself and felt something inside her own chest hardening into rage that had nowhere to go. In November, one of the younger girls, 18-year-old Sophia Rise, attempted escape. She made it past the dormitory window during the night, cutting through the bars with a file she'd somehow acquired. She ran across the dark fields toward the distant road, but the estate employed night watchmen with dogs. They found her within 2 hours. What happened next was designed as a lesson. The entire compound was assembled in the yard the following morning. Sophia was brought out, her dress torn and muddy from being dragged back. Richard Blackburn himself presided over her punishment. She was whipped in front of everyone, 10 lashes that left her back bleeding and her voice raw from screaming. But the physical punishment wasn't the worst of it. Richard announced that Sophia's attempted escape had voided her family's contract. Her parents and younger siblings would be deported immediately. Sophia herself would remain at the estate to work off the debt her escape attempt had incurred, a debt that would take years to repay. The mothers watched Sophia's family loaded into a truck that afternoon, saw the way her father looked back with helpless grief as he was driven away. Sophia remained behind, now completely alone, with no family to protect her or even witness what would be done to her. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be punished, not just individually but collectively, and the punishment would fall on those you loved most. That night, Rosa added a new section to her diary. She began recording not just what was happening, but the names and specific actions of the men responsible. Richard Blackburn's preferred victim was Lucia Santos. Thomas Blackburn favored the younger girls. The overseer Garrett had assaulted at least 3 daughters that Rosa knew of. She documented everything with cold precision, understanding that if this record ever surfaced, it needed to name names. The other mothers noticed the change in Rosa. She'd become harder, more focused. During their brief moments together, she spoke differently, asking questions about the estate's routines, about where things were kept, about schedules and patterns. She was gathering information with purpose now, though she hadn't yet shared what that purpose might be. Winter approached, bringing shorter days and colder nights. The daughters continued to be summoned. The mothers continued to watch and wait and document. And Rosa continued to add pages to her hidden diary, building a testament to atrocity that she hoped would someday matter to someone somehow. Winter arrived in the Central Valley with cold that seeped through the dormitory walls. By January of 1924, the daughters had endured 6 months of systematic abuse. Some had grown numb to it. Others, like Alina, had retreated so far inside themselves that they barely seemed present anymore. But it was what happened to Anne Flores that finally shattered whatever fragile equilibrium the mothers had been clinging to. Anne had been summoned 3 times in 1 week, an unusually intense schedule. When she returned the 3rd morning, she was feverish and pale. Catherine tried to keep her in bed, but the overseers insisted all workers report to the fields regardless of illness. Anne lasted 2 hours before collapsing among the orange trees. The estate had a small infirmary, but Catherine wasn't allowed to stay with her daughter. By evening, Anne's fever had worsened. An infection had taken hold, the kind that required immediate medical attention. Catherine begged the overseers to call a doctor from town. They refused. Bringing an outsider to the compound meant risk, meant questions that might be asked about the conditions about the girls. Instead, they moved Anne to the cellar beneath the main house, isolated from the other workers. The official reason was quarantine, but the real purpose was concealment. Catherine was barred from seeing her own daughter. For 3 days, she heard nothing. The estate's management claimed Anne was being monitored, that she was receiving care, that outside medical attention was unnecessary. On the 4th day, Catherine was summoned to the overseer's office and informed that her daughter had died during the night. The cause would be listed as pneumonia. There would be a burial in the estate's small cemetery, a plot of land beyond the eastern fields where previous workers had been interred over the years. No outside funeral home would be involved. Catherine demanded to see the body. What she saw confirmed everything she'd feared. Anne's face was bruised. Her arms showed defensive wounds, marks that predated the illness. The infection that killed her had originated from internal injuries, the kind that came from repeated trauma. Pneumonia might have finished the job, but violence had started it. The burial took place the following morning. 23 mothers and their surviving daughters stood in the cold as Anne's body was lowered into unmarked ground. No ceremony, no words spoken except a perfunctory prayer from the estate minister. The Blackburn family didn't attend. Neither did any of the men who'd used Anne before her body gave out. Catherine stood at the graveside long after the others had been marched back to work. Rosa stayed with her, and they said nothing because there was nothing to say. But something had shifted. Rosa felt it in her own chest, saw it reflected in Catherine's face. They'd reached a boundary that couldn't be endured, a point where continuing to survive meant accepting the unacceptable. That night, after the dormitory locked, the mothers gathered in whispered conversation. Catherine spoke first, her voice flat and cold. "They killed my daughter. They'll kill all our daughters eventually." No one disagreed. The pattern was cleared. The girls were being used up, discarded when they broke. Sophia Rise had tried to escape and lost her family. Anne Flores had tried to endure and lost her life. There was no path forward that led to safety. Rosa retrieved her diary from beneath the floorboard. She showed the other mothers what she'd been documenting. Pages and pages of names and dates and detailed accounts. Evidence of everything that had been done. "We can't save them by surviving," Rosa said quietly. "And we can't let this continue." The other mothers understood immediately. They'd all been thinking it in the private darkness of their own minds, but hadn't dared speak it aloud. Now Catherine had given them permission to acknowledge the truth. They couldn't escape. They couldn't fight and win. The men had guns, had power, had the protection of local law. But there were other options, darker options, paths that required accepting costs they'd once considered unthinkable. The mothers looked at each other in the dim dormitory light, and slowly, wordlessly, an understanding passed between them. Anne's death had been the breaking point. What came next would be something else entirely. The planning happened in fragments, whispered conversations during fieldwork, when the overseers weren't watching, glances exchanged during meals that communicated entire thoughts. The mothers couldn't meet openly or for extended periods, so they developed a language of subtle gestures and brief encounters that built toward a collective understanding. Rosa became the central coordinator, not through any formal decision, but because she'd already been documenting everything. Her diary transformed from a record of atrocities into something more practical. She began mapping the compound, sketching guard positions and noting their rotation schedules. She tracked which doors were locked at what times, where keys were kept, which buildings were accessible after dark. Catherine contributed tactical observations. She'd noticed that the main house staff followed rigid routines. Dinner was served to the Blackburn family and their associates at 700 each evening. The men gathered in the dining room, all of them in one location, while the kitchen staff cleared and cleaned. The guards remained at their exterior posts. For approximately 90 minutes, the house's security was focused outward, not inward. Maria Santos studied the storage buildings during her work assignments. She noted where lamp oil was kept for the estate's lighting, where rope and tools were stored, what could be accessed without drawing immediate attention. She passed this information to Rosa during Sunday chapel services, details whispered during hymns. The mothers faced an impossible calculation that they discussed in painful, halting conversations. Their daughters couldn't escape alone. The estate was too isolated, the pursuit too certain. Even if one or two girls made it to the distant town, what then? They had no money, no allies, and the local authorities would simply return them to the Blackburns. But if the mothers tried to escape with their daughters, they'd be caught before they reached the compound's edge. The men had horses, trucks, weapons. A group of women and girls on foot across open valley land would be visible for miles and retrieved within hours. The only scenario that gave the daughters a real chance was one the mothers barely allowed themselves to articulate at first. If the men were occupied, truly occupied in a way that prevented pursuit, the girls might have time to scatter and disappear before anyone could organize a search. It would require the kind of distraction that couldn't be ignored or quickly resolved. Rosa wrote this logic in her diary, then crossed it out, then wrote it again. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. The daughters' freedom required the mother's sacrifice, and not just their lives but their willingness to do something that would damn them in the eyes of anyone who learned of it later. They made their preparations slowly over the months that followed. Small items disappeared from the main house during cleaning duties. Matches taken from the kitchen. Lengths of rope from the storage shed. Bottles of lamp oil carried out in apron pockets over weeks until they'd accumulated enough. Everything was hidden in various locations, never in one place that could be discovered in a single search. Rosa updated her diary with a new section written in March of 1924. She listed each mother's name and daughter's name. She documented every instance of abuse in excruciating detail, naming the perpetrators with full specificity: Richard Blackburn, Thomas Blackburn, the overseer Garrett, visiting business associates whose names she'd learned. She included dates, descriptions, evidence. Then she wrote a final entry explaining what they intended to do and why. She wrapped the diary in multiple layers of oilcloth to protect it from moisture and decay. During a Sunday service while others prayed, she slipped away to the chapel's foundation and found a loose stone. She hid the diary deep in the gap behind it, betting that someday someone would renovate this building and find what she'd left behind. The mothers began writing letters to their daughters. These were harder than the planning had been. How do you explain to your child that you've chosen to die? How do you ask forgiveness for abandoning them even as you're giving them their only chance at freedom? The letters were brief, inadequate, but necessary. Rosa sealed hers for Elena and gave it to Maria, who would ensure they were delivered after. By early March of 1925, everything was ready. The mothers had made their choice, prepared their materials, and steeled themselves for what was coming. They waited only for the right night, when circumstances aligned and courage held firm. The final preparations occurred in the 2 weeks before March 15, 1925. The mothers moved with careful deliberation, their actions designed to appear normal while accomplishing purposes the overseers couldn't see. Rosa volunteered for extra cleaning duty at the main house. This gave her access to ground floor rooms during daylight hours when she could study the layout more thoroughly. She noted which windows opened easily, which doors could be barred from inside, where the lamp oil reserves were kept in the kitchen stores. She memorized exit points and structural details, information she shared with the others through their careful communication network. Catherine took inventory of tools during her field assignments. She knew where the harvesting implements were stored, which ones could serve dual purposes, how to access the equipment shed where larger tools were kept. She moved these items gradually, a few at a time, hiding them in locations near the main house where they could be retrieved quickly when needed. The bottles of lamp oil they'd been accumulating over months were distributed to different hiding spots, behind bushes near the main house foundation, in the woodshed that supplied the kitchen, under the back porch steps. No single cache large enough to draw attention if discovered, but collectively sufficient for their purpose. Maria Santos handled the most dangerous preparation, acquiring the letters. She'd convinced the estate minister through careful manipulation over weeks that she wanted to write to family members about religious matters. He'd provided paper and envelopes, assuming anything she wrote would be intercepted and screened as always. Instead, Maria distributed the materials to the mothers for their final messages to their daughters. Each letter was different, but they all contained similar elements: explanations of love, apologies for what would seem like abandonment, instructions to flee when the moment came and never look back, reassurances that this choice, this terrible choice, was made willingly because it was the only way to give them freedom. Rosa's letter to Elena was 3 pages, written and rewritten until the words felt adequate, though they never could be. She explained that a mother's love sometimes meant letting go in the most complete way possible. She described the life she'd wanted for Elena, the future that had been stolen from them both. She asked forgiveness and promised that even in death, she would be proud of whatever life her daughter managed to build. The letters were sealed and given to Sophia Rise to hide. Sophia, whose family had already been taken from her, had nothing left to lose and could be trusted with this final task. She would give the letters to the daughters after, when understanding would be unavoidable and necessary. During the first week of March, the mothers began saying goodbye to their daughters without saying the words. Rosa held Elena longer during their brief moments together. Catherine touched Anna's grave marker each morning before work, a ritual of farewell. They memorized their daughters' faces, stored up these last glimpses against the darkness ahead. The mothers also made peace among themselves. Old tensions dissolved. Small grievances from the months of shared captivity evaporated. They spoke to each other with tenderness, acknowledging the bond they'd formed through shared trauma and shared purpose. 12 women who'd been strangers 2 years ago had become something else. Witnesses to each other's suffering, co-conspirators in resistance, sisters in the choice they'd made. On March 14th, Rosa retrieved her diary from the chapel foundation one final time. She added a last entry, dated and signed. It read simply, "Tomorrow we act. May God forgive us for what we do, and may our daughters forgive us for leaving them. We die to set them free." She returned the diary to its hiding place, pressing the stone back into position. Someday, she hoped, someone would find it. The truth would surface. The names of the guilty would be known. But whether that happened or not, whether justice came or the story remained buried, the mothers had made their decision. That night in the dormitory, they said nothing to their daughters. The girls couldn't know, couldn't be implicated or burdened with foreknowledge. They had to be protected from what was coming even as they were saved by it. The mothers lay in their beds and waited for morning. Each woman alone with her thoughts, her fears, her resolve. Tomorrow would be March 15th. Tomorrow everything would end and begin. March 15th, 1925 began like any other day at the Blackburn compound. The mothers rose before dawn and moved through their field assignments with the same mechanical precision they'd maintained for 2 years. But beneath the surface routine, something had crystallized. They moved with coordinated purpose, each woman aware of her role in what would unfold after sunset. At 600, the mothers returned from the fields as scheduled. They entered the dormitory with their daughters and waited for the evening meal to be delivered. The girls noticed nothing unusual in their mother's behavior, no signal of what was coming. When dinner arrived at 6:30, the mothers ate slowly, deliberately fueling themselves for what lay ahead. At 7:15, as dusk settled over the compound, Rosa stood and moved to the dormitory door. The other mothers rose with her. Elena looked up in confusion. "Where are you going?" "Stay here," Rosa said quietly. "No matter what happens, you stay inside this building. Do you understand?" Before Elena could respond, the mothers filed out. Catherine was the last to leave. She turned back and looked at the confused, frightened faces of the daughters gathered inside. Then she pulled the door closed and dropped the external bar into place, locking them in. The sound of that bar falling was the point of no return. The mothers had retrieved their hidden implements during the transition from fields to dormitory, tools concealed under their work dresses. They moved quickly across the compound yard toward the main house. The guards were at their usual perimeter positions, not expecting any threat from the docile workers they'd controlled for 2 years. At the main house, light glowed from the dining room windows. Inside, the Blackburn family and their associates had gathered for their evening meal. Richard and Thomas Blackburn, the overseer Garrett, 2 visiting landowners who'd been guests at the estate for 3 days. All the men who'd used the daughters were seated together, exactly as the mothers had observed week after week. The kitchen entrance was unlocked, as always during meal service. The mothers entered in silence. The cook and kitchen staff looked up in surprise, but before anyone could raise alarm, Maria Santos blocked the interior door. The kitchen workers, all women from the compound themselves, seemed to understand immediately. They stepped back without protest. Rosa led the way into the ground floor hallway. The other mothers fanned out with purpose born of careful planning. They retrieved the hidden lamp oil and began pouring it along the walls, across the floors, saturating the wooden structure's lower level. The smell filled the air, sharp and unmistakable. From the dining room came the sound of conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses. The men were oblivious to what was unfolding just beyond their walls. Catherine and 2 other mothers barred the main entrances from inside, using rope to secure the door shut. Others blocked the ground floor windows. They worked with swift efficiency, each woman knowing her task, trapping the men inside the building's upper level while ensuring their own position on the lower floor. When the preparations were complete, the mothers gathered in the central hallway. Rosa held a box of matches. The other women carried the farming tools they'd hidden, prepared for what would come when the men realized they were trapped. Rosa struck the first match. The flame caught on the oil-soaked floor and spread instantly, racing along the walls in both directions. Within seconds, the ground floor was engulfed, fire climbing toward the ceiling, smoke beginning to fill the space. Above them, someone shouted. Footsteps thundered across the upper floor. The men had smelled the smoke, realized something was catastrophically wrong. They tried the stairs, but the fire had already blocked that escape route. They moved to windows, but the mothers had positioned themselves below, armed and waiting. Richard Blackburn appeared at an upper window, screaming for help. He tried to climb out and dropped to the ground. Catherine was waiting with a harvesting blade. He fell back inside, wounded, and the window filled with smoke. The fire consumed the structure with terrifying speed. The mothers remained on the ground floor, standing in the flames they'd created, blocking every possible escape route. The heat became unbearable, but they didn't move. They'd accepted this outcome months ago. Above them, the men's screams faded as smoke overcame them. The mothers stood their ground until the structure began to collapse. And then there was only fire and darkness in the end they'd chosen. The daughters heard the screaming first. Inside the locked dormitory, Elena and the others rushed to the barred windows and saw the main house engulfed in flames, fire reaching into the night sky like something alive and furious. They pounded on the door, shouting for someone to let them out, but the bar held firm from the outside. The guards at the perimeter posts ran toward the burning building, abandoning their positions in the chaos. Some tried to enter through windows but were driven back by the intensity of the heat. Others attempted to organize a water brigade from the compound well, but the fire had spread too quickly, consuming the entire structure within minutes. It was the overseer's assistant, a young man named Peters, who'd arrived at the estate only weeks earlier, who finally unbarred the dormitory door. The daughters burst out and ran toward the inferno, Elena in the lead, screaming for her mother. The other women from the compound tried to hold them back, grabbing at their arms and clothes. But the daughters fought with desperate strength. Sophia Rise, who knew what the mothers had planned, stood directly in Elena's path. "You can't help them," Sophia said, gripping Elena's shoulders. "They're already gone. They did this so you could leave." Elena collapsed to her knees, still staring at the flames. Around her, the other daughters were doing the same, watching the fire consume the building that held their mothers inside. The sound of the structure collapsing sent sparks spiraling into the darkness, and with it went any possibility of rescue or reversal. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived from town at dawn, summoned by Peters who'd ridden through the night, there was nothing left but smoking ruins and questions no one wanted to answer. The county fire marshal walked through the wreckage and noted the smell of lamp oil, the barred doors, the positioning of bodies that suggested intentional blocking of exits. His official report would list the cause as unexplained conflagration, likely accidental in origin. But his private notes, sealed in county archives and not opened for decades, told a different story. He'd found evidence of deliberate arson. The bodies of 12 women on the ground floor, many still clutching implements that weren't kitchen tools. The bodies of men trapped upstairs, some showing injuries that predated the fire itself. The estate's remaining management made quick decisions. The story given to newspapers was simple: a tragic kitchen accident during meal preparation, a fire that spread too quickly to contain. The workers were released from their contracts immediately and given transportation to wherever they wanted to go. The compound was to be evacuated and closed. Sophia distributed the letters that afternoon. Elena opened hers with shaking hands and read her mother's explanation, the words blurred by tears. Around her, the other daughters read their own letters and understood simultaneously what had been done and why. They had choices now, but every choice was shadowed by grief. Some daughters chose to return to Mexico, carrying the weight of their mother's sacrifice back to relatives who'd never fully understand. Others disappeared into California's growing cities, taking new names and building lives they would never discuss. A few, like Elena, simply vanished into the state's vast geography, seeking anonymity and distance from everything the compound represented. The Blackburn estate was dissolved within months. Distant relatives inherited the property but wanted nothing to do with land that had generated such tragedy. The fields went fallow. The buildings decayed. Local people avoided the place, uncomfortable with the questions that lingered in the empty dormitories and burned foundations. The daughters scattered like seeds on wind, each carrying her own private grief and her own understanding of what freedom had cost. None of them would ever speak publicly about what their mothers had done. Most would never speak of it at all, even to their own children in later years. They'd been freed, but freedom purchased through such sacrifice felt less like liberation than like exile. They lived because their mothers had died. They had futures because their mothers had chosen to have none. That mathematics would haunt every one of them for the rest of their lives, a debt that could never be repaid to women who'd asked for nothing except that their daughters survive and somehow find a way to live. The chapel stood abandoned for 43 years. The Blackburn compound had been sold and resold, parceled into smaller properties, most of the original buildings demolished or left to collapse under their own weight. But the chapel, being stone construction, endured through decades of neglect until a developer purchased the land in 1968 with plans to build housing. The demolition crew arrived in early spring. They were 3 days into dismantling the chapel's interior when a worker named James Pritchard noticed something odd about the foundation stones near the altar. One section didn't align properly with the others, as if it had been disturbed and inexpertly replaced. Pritchard pulled at the loose stone out of curiosity more than any expectation of finding something significant. Behind it was a gap in the foundation, and wedged deep in that gap was a package wrapped in multiple layers of oilcloth, remarkably well preserved despite the decades. He brought it to his supervisor, who opened it carefully. Inside was a diary, its pages covered in cramped handwriting, dated entries spanning from August 1933 to March 1925. The supervisor read the first few pages and immediately understood this was something beyond his authority to handle. He contacted the County Historical Society. Dr. Margaret Chen, a researcher specializing in California labor history, received the diary 2 days later. She read it through the night, her academic detachment gradually giving way to horror as Rosa Delgado's meticulous documentation revealed what had happened at the Blackburn estate. The diary contained everything: names of the victims and the perpetrators, dates of specific incidents, descriptions of the systematic abuse inflicted on the daughters, the mother's growing desperation, the planning stages of what Rosa called "or final act of protection." The last entry, dated March 14, 1925, laid out their intention with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. Dr. Chen cross-referenced the diary against available records. The county fire marshal's private notes, finally accessible after the mandated 40-year seal, corroborated Rosa's account. Sealed court documents from the estate's dissolution revealed financial records showing payments to local law enforcement exactly as the diary claimed. Medical examiner reports, stamped confidential and forgotten in archive boxes, confirmed details about Anne Flores' death that matched Rosa's documentation precisely. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. 12 mothers had died deliberately, taking their abusers with them to free daughters who had no other escape. It hadn't been an accident or a tragedy born of kitchen carelessness. It had been an act of desperate resistance against systematic sexual exploitation that local authorities had been paid to ignore. Dr. Chen published her findings in 1970 in an academic journal focused on labor history and immigrant experiences. The article generated immediate controversy. Descendants of the Blackburn family demanded retractions. Local officials claimed the interpretation was speculative, but the diary itself, with its detailed contemporary accounts, proved impossible to dismiss. A memorial was dedicated in 1972 at the site of the former compound. 12 names were carved in stone: Rosa Delgado, Catherine Flores, Maria Santos, and 9 others whose witness and sacrifice had been buried for nearly 5 decades. The dedication ceremony was attended by historians, activists, and descendants of other families who'd worked the Central Valley estates. But the daughters themselves never came. By then, those who'd survived were elderly women scattered across the American West. Some had died. Others had built lives they couldn't or wouldn't abandon to revisit that trauma. A few were contacted by researchers and declined all requests for interviews. Their silence was absolute and understandable. They'd been freed, but they'd also been orphaned by the very act that saved them. Elena Delgado, if she was still alive, never identified herself publicly. Neither did any of the other daughters. They'd taken their mother's gift of freedom and used it to disappear completely, which was perhaps what their mothers had wanted all along: not fame or recognition or even justice in any conventional sense, just the chance to live without being destroyed. The diary remains in the California State Archives, available to researchers but rarely requested. It stands as testament to atrocity and resistance both, a record of how far human beings can be pushed and what they're capable of when all other options disappear. The mothers who wrote it didn't live to see it found, but they trusted that someday someone would look behind that stone and understand what they'd done and why. Their names are remembered now. Their daughters' names remain unknown, protected by the anonymity their mothers died to give them. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the depths of maternal love and the price of freedom, hit that like button and subscribe to hear more untold histories that deserve to be remembered. Because some stories are too important to stay buried forever.